Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Ebert, and I am a founding member of the LitX educational cohort. In conjunction with NYCC, New York Comic Con's Metaverse event, LitX put on some educational programming, and we are posting those on our YouTube channel here. Our first posted panel will be Comics as Major, graphic novel titles for post-secondary education. Our panel, moderated by educator Gill will be discussing how you can incorporate graphic novels into a college course and the specific titles that you might utilize as you are teaching with graphic novels. So, take a look at our panel, enjoy, and I'll see you on the other side.
Welcome everyone to Comics as a Major, which is a LitX panel to discuss graphic novels in the post-secondary education field. Today we have a number and a wide variety of experts in this field. So I'm going to start with having them introduce themselves. And we'll start with Lisa.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm the founder of Mogo Impact, a PR strategy firm. Do a lot of marketing for AWA Studios and Magnetic Press, and I'm also a former teacher.
Great. And how about you, John? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, I'm John Weaver. I'm sort of the odd person out. I'm not a comics professional and I don't teach college. I'm a replacement for someone else, but I've been teaching comics for close to 20 years now. I teach seniors in high school seniors. And I'm going to give you the books today that I would love to teach to my seniors, but can't. So that's mine.
Well, but you're teaching future college students. So
yes, I am.
Foundation. And Joel, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Joel Christian Gill. I am an associate professor of illustration at Mass College of Art and Design, and I've written and drawn a number of books, including Strange Fruit, Tales of the Talented Tenth. My latest book is Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence. And real quick, it's been 143 days since the police officers who killed Breonna Taylor have not been arrested, and I just want to put that out there into the world.
Talia?
Yeah, hi, I'm Talia Hurwich. I hold several different hats or several different roles, I guess, in this wide world of comics and education, as wide as you want to define that word. I used to be a middle school teacher, teaching grades 5 through 8. I am currently at NYU, where I study comics in education, and I co-wrote a book with Dr. Merrill Jaffe on how to teach comics in elementary, middle school, titled Worth 1,000 Words, using graphic novels to teach visual and verbal literacy. And more specifically today, I teach at NYU in a course under philosophy of education titled Learning and the Meaning of Life. And we've started throwing comics and graphic novels into the syllabus. And it's really exciting to be able to teach comics in a great books class.
Fabulous. And is it Fareed?
It is. That's perfect, Jill.
Awesome. Good.
Hi, everybody. My name is Fareed Haq. I'm dialing in from London, and I am very much a practitioner. Sort of grew up as a huge comic book, graphic novel fanboy, and I was the engineer who was always drawing at the back of the room. Finally found my feet and managed to quit my job and start a small comic book publishing business. It's called Early Stage Studios. So what we do is we actually make graphic novels for education. So sort of a mix of our own projects and commissions. I guess the commissions allow us to live the dream and make the stuff that we really want to make. So far, we work with the US government, which is one of our largest clients, working on comic books specifically to educate people in higher education, tertiary, on critical issues, social issues, issues like germ warfare and the Senate investing traditionally in germ warfare. Max Brooks wrote that. I directed that creatively, and we have a whole team of people that we work with around the world that make this stuff happen. I was an educationalist. I've been a teaching assistant at university, and was a senior don at the University of Toronto, and have always believed in sharing comic books and graphic novels as a way to share soft power education, get the message out. I just think it lands really well with people in that age group. Thank you.
Great. And I failed to introduce myself. I'm Gill Gerber. I am a middle school teacher and comic books advocate for comics in the classroom. I've taught everything from kindergarten through 12th grade. So let's start off with kind of the context for the panel. And in your experience and expertise, what is the role of comics study at the university level? And I would like us to kind of dig into the different ways comics can be used in college, and also be thinking about what students might want in terms of comics experience. So thinking about like academic, creator, industry professional. So I guess we could start with you, Lisa, because you could, oh, actually, or Joel, go for it.
I'm sorry, I was like, should I raise my hand? So I think that there's two paths when you think about comics in higher education. There's the teaching with comics, and there's the teaching of comics. So there's two completely distinctive things. And I think teaching with comics, I've always said, is like the sneakiest way to teach somebody anything, because you give them a comic and halfway through they just learned about whatever topic you just gave them, right? But then teaching comics is such a new thing right now with like it's just such a small thing. Like I built one of the few comic programs in the country, studio programs at a small college in New Hampshire before I went to Mass Art. And there's just not a lot of people out there that can talk about it and talk about the teaching of it, and don't understand the sort of intricacies in like comics as a medium as opposed to a genre, because I think a lot of people have a tendency to equate those two things. That comics is about, I tell people I draw comics all the time. They're like, do you draw from Marvel or DC? And I'm like, neither. I draw about obscure Black history, right? So I think there's this idea that people sort of equate it to this one thing as opposed to thinking about it as a medium, which is really great with like the Comic Study Society and a lot of the programs that are popping up all over the country now, that people are actually digging into the idea of like there's theory and there's practice, and then sort of looking at what's happened in Europe and like that we ignored for like 50 years, and like how people have thought about it that way, versus teaching with comics, which is I don't know, it's kind of like, for me, I feel like teaching with comics is kind of like teaching with books. It's just a thing you do. So it's not like it's another tool to use in the classroom. Sometimes prose works, sometimes teaching, sometimes comics works. But I feel like comics, because people automatically don't think about those comics as think about them in an educational standpoint. It's like, oh, it's fun, and it's just like you give them this book, and it's just like, I'm going to go read the graphic novel version of a thing, not realizing that is just as complicated as a prose version.
I do have to agree with Joel. I don't see it as anything different from reading a novel, poetry, prose, whatever. I feel like in any of those different mediums, you are teaching kids or college students very critical analytical skills that they can use in whatever profession they end up going into, honestly. And the great thing about comics is you're combining words with artwork. And a lot of times, even in prose, when they're discussing, the actual environment of the room and what it looked like in the setting, students can't really visualize that. And if you have a really great, I'll bring this up because it's one of my favorite books from one of my publishers, Magnetic Press. It's called The Ballad of Yaya. And what it does is it's telling a story about friendship during the time of war. A war that's very obscure to most people, which is the Battle of Shanghai. And it was very, very interesting because as you're going through the actual like word bubbles and little descriptions and narration, the setting, the artwork actually just puts you in that place where you're seeing the different melding of cultures in that particular place and time with colonialism. So you're talking about art history, you're talking about history itself. people's likes and tastes back then. So you're learning all sorts of, it's more a holistic way of teaching in a lot of ways. So I really think that if you really want to help kids and adults too, be more empathetic and understanding of how society was back then or even now, having that visual aid really helps.
If I can add into some really fantastic comments, I think one thing that has really struck me about teaching with comics, particularly recently, is how international that can be. I teach at a university level where, middle school doesn't have that many foreign students, and who knows what's going to happen next year at the colleges. Fingers can stay crossed for that. But I'm used to teaching a lot of kids who grew up with manga. And that is both a similar and yet different visual culture. And within that context, if you want to talk about the medium, there's an exchange there. And, if you've read Scott McCloud, that scratches the surface. It doesn't go into all of those intricacies of that. And so you can start talking about this cultural exchange that happens. Beyond that, as I said before, I use comics in a great books class. And this was also the first time that we had anything from South America in the syllabus. And, it's not to say that that Fabian Luna and Gabriel Baz Day Tripper is, the quintessential South American graphic novel. That's an absurd thing to assign any text whatsoever. But it starts to scratch the surface.
Yeah, go ahead, Judd.
Yeah, I'm just going to reemphasize what people have already said before, that when I teach Watchmen, I also teach other comics too, but when I teach Watchmen to my seniors, it's much more complex. Honestly, that's much more complex with the way the words and the art interact than any novel I teach. And I teach, a lot of novels, and they're complex, but they're not as complex as Watchmen or other comics who do the same thing.
Yeah, the Watchmen, I feel like, should be in every college or senior course, honestly, because it touches on history, culture, all sorts of different things, and it alludes to different politics, and it's just so well-rounded. It's really a new world that they can analyze, and they can do a lot of compare and contrasts and things like that. You really actually teach the kids to be really analytical, and I think having that skill, and I think it's a travesty that so many universities are cutting down on their English and literature departments, because kids are losing, students and even adults are losing this ability to comprehend and empathize with people that are not like themselves, because they're not reading different types of literature and trying to put themselves in that space of what that character is going through and things like that. So, yes.
I think that Watchmen in and of itself, just to fanboy about Watchmen again, and specifically when you're talking about teaching with comics, which I think Lisa alluded to, but comics as a theory, there are things that happen in Watchmen that you can't do in prose. You could probably do with television, but it's a little bit more complicated with the way in which the story structure is worked. It's not really plot driven. It's more character driven. There are multiple narratives happening. There's a lot of symbolism happens in it that you can't really do that. Unreliable narrator is one type of, there's just a lot of things. I just wanted to say that real quick, fanboy about the Watchmen, because I have taught that for a number of years, and it's right up there with high literature for.
So I think I'd like to add one more thing, which is that traditionally we've tried to look at the teaching of subjects such as history and economics and political science through graphic novels and comic books. And there are certain subjects certainly that lend themselves more easily to the format, right? Because I think I'll start with history, because we'd run a Kickstarter on a project called Make History. And we'd taken all of O-level, which is sort of high school history, and made it into more of an illustrated history. And we did that because I remember when I was in school, we'd be looking at these history textbooks, and you'd just be dying for that one page where there would be a map of something or some old propaganda poster or something. You'd be flipping the pages looking for the next one. And so I often thought, I'm like, why is it that the whole thing isn't visual? Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think that while on one hand, a lot of these subjects are easy to teach, perhaps using graphical aids, there are also other subjects like chemistry, math, that I find are more challenging to teach. And I'm looking for resources such as those just to see what people are doing in the marketplace. And so while we're on this panel, I'd love to hear more about other people's exposure to perhaps more science or not, and other subjects which might be more difficult to teach through the medium.
Yeah, so
good.
I mean, some of my research has been in STEM comics, specifically how science teachers we spoke with 17 science teachers in, I think it's either North Dakota or it's in the Midwest, using the worlds of viruses. And one of the things that we noticed is that with textbooks, this is both in history and in science, often students have two simultaneous reading experiences that don't overlap. They read the text and then they look at the pictures, or they skim through the pictures and then they read the texts. And it's not interacting, not in the way that you really hope so, because the pictures are supposed to be paired with specific text. It isn't, it's not that crazy, it's not that out there. And with a graphic novel, the texts and the words are interwoven. There is no two different readings in that. You can more closely read it afterwards, and if a science content comic is done well, you should be reading it several times. That's what close reading is all about. But there's always going to be that cohesive single text that you're experiencing.
One thing that I've been kind of researching after going to ALA Book Expo last year and Book Expo last year, both times there were several medical school librarians that came up to me and kind of spoke to me about their need for medical books. And I think it goes back to what you were saying, that they want to combine both of it together. And then I know a lot of doctors and people who are going through medical school. And one thing that they always have to learn is how to be more empathetic with their patients and being able to speak to them properly and have that right bedside manner, as well as the technical knowledge. And I feel like graphic novels would be really great in helping aspiring doctors be able to learn that. But I think also they want graphic novels that kind of teach the technical skills that they are learning as well as an aid. And I think that's a really great market to kind of explore, especially for your company if it's about education and things like that. So
yeah, I'm actually curious with the growth of graphic medicine and the how well Nick Susanis's Unflattening is starting to kind of have a broader audience. What you are seeing at the university level, whether are you seeing a shift to more graphic literature, more awareness outside of just the humanities, or are you seeing a little bit of pushback? I know the demand is obviously there, and Joel, at some point I'd like you to talk about starting that program and the demand at the university level as well.
So I just participated in a series of workshops, online free workshops with Creota Wilberg and Georgia Weber, about comics and medicine, and how that's a huge an industry right now. And, you know, it's really interesting that I think comics in medicine, or comics in anything, just say comics and this cross section of whatever, seems really new because we've been ignoring it for a long time. We've been ignoring it's like it's comics is that stuff over there. I actually had somebody at one time in one of my when I was teaching, I was drawing, because I draw on an iPad. I was drawing on an iPad, and he came by and he was like, and he goes, "Is that what you do your little comics on?" He was another faculty. He was another faculty member. He's like, he actually did this little hand motion, like, "This is what you do your little comics on." And I legitimately said to him, I'm like, "The New York Times has written about my comics. Have they written about your paintings?" Which shut him up pretty quickly. But and I think that idea, or just like the fact that we keep saying comics and graphic novels, right? Because people like to introduce me as a graphic novelist, which sounds weird. I'm like, I'm a cartoonist. I draw cartoons, right? That's okay. And if you think that cartoons are easy or simple, or there's something sort of like dumb about them, go try to do them, because it's not as easy as you think. But there is a demand in higher education for comics, especially the cross section between comics and everything else, right? Because you look at Persepolis, which is like course adoption in schools. That book sells like 30,000 copies a year. And so publishers are interested in getting books like that, and they're trying to do things like that. I'm currently adapting Stamped from the Beginning, A History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram Kendi. And this is another thing, if you think comics are easy, try adapting a 529-page comic history tome into a 250-page comic. And, you know, there's interesting things about that when you look at how comics works on a visual level. So there are some things that I don't actually have to write out for really long. Like I can draw, like picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't have to draw out all of these different things, but I also have to figure out, I have to know what kind of shoes Thomas Jefferson is wearing. Like I actually have to know that, when you don't necessarily have to do that if you're just writing Thomas Jefferson. Like Ibram, when he was writing about Thomas Jefferson, he never had to consider what he was writing with, where he was writing with, or anything else, but that's beside the point. But there's this idea about how colleges are really looking at illustration departments have been flat for about 10 years. They have not been growing. And so a lot of schools, a lot of colleges, and if you look at ACAD schools and you look at art schools, schools and colleges in art and design, you can see that the places where art schools are growing, they're dying in painting departments, but they're growing with animation, 4D, like interactive design, and comics. Those are the places in which colleges and universities are growing. And so they're looking at this, especially now that things are contracting, because a lot of schools are dying, right? Because there was just too many. There was like 3,500 schools of art and design, and that's too many. And so now that they're contracting, now people are looking to be competitive. And how do we grow our institution without that gives people something? And I actually interviewed for a job a couple of years ago, and the chair of that department, I ended up turning them down to do something else, but the chair of that department told me that he was an old school illustration guy, didn't think that comics was a viable way to do things as an illustrator. But now with Kickstarter and with, you know, online publishing and self-publishing and webcomics, they're seeing that there's a way in which to do that. And I think that's the way in which we have to move through this thing, and especially in higher education, because comics is sort of a broader thing. It's you have to have more skills to do comics than you do illustration. But if you have all the skills for comics, you can do illustration. And I think that's the thing that colleges are looking at and sort of building. And I'm sorry, I've talked too.
One thing I do want to say is I'm glad that so many colleges are branching out and meeting a market demand for those different types of mediums, and not just painting. Because if you really want to study art, you need to study all of it and have a good understanding and be able to be flexible too, especially if you're going to become a business. If you're going to be a freelancer and create your own artwork, I think one thing that's very, very important for those art students, even English students and things like that, is they need to take business courses so they know how to actually manage their time and be able to market themselves properly. For those art students there's so many art students out there that fail because they don't know how to do that part, and they become starving, artists or whatever, and they end up switching to something else that they're not passionate about. So it's very important that they actually have that business portion of it as well as the technical art and understanding of comics.
Most colleges, sorry guys, I just want to jump in really quick, but most colleges actually do teach. They do have some kind of course like artists as I'm professional artist, or we teach it at Mass Art. We taught it at my previous school. And I think where the disconnect is that people who get creative degrees are not actually taught to be entrepreneurs. And I think that's the key when you're thinking about moving forward as a creative, is not necessarily, how do I sell my widget to this person over here? It's more about what are my transferable skills and how can I use them? Because I got an MFA in painting, and I have an undergraduate degree in graphic design, one in fine art, and my MFA in painting, and now I draw comics about Black history. And that's legitimately because I was looking at how to make creative practice work, and I was being more entrepreneurial about that process. And I think a lot of schools typically, there are some schools out there that typically sort of spearhead students into a specific thing, right? Like there are a lot of people, and you've all read books like Anya's Ghost, or any of the things that have been animators who did comics, or cartoonists who have done animation, and I think, or cartoonists who are filmmakers. And I think that that's the thing that I think people need to understand about the skills of comics, because comics are, you have to be able to write, you have to be able to tell stories, you have to be able to draw, you have to be able to meet deadlines, you have to be able to do this stuff all on a timeline. There's a lot of skills that take place when you're trying to teach someone how to do comics that you don't necessarily need all those skills to do some of the other things. Like if you want to be a painter, you don't necessarily need to know how to tell a story if you want to be a painter. If you want to be a designer, you don't need to know how plot works for the most part. You don't have to know those things specifically, but to draw comics, to write and draw to be a cartoonist, which is combining writing and drawing, you have to be able to do those things. And then within that, you actually have to be entrepreneurial to figure out how those things work, how to make those things work in the world.
I'd like to add a layer for the educators that are on the panel. What are some things that you think are essential if you want to study comics as a medium, as opposed to as a creator, or to teach comics integrated into your course?
John, you can go first. Go okay, thank you. I also want to circle back to your question before, more specifically about the comics and in those kooky and wild places, which I think one of the nice things about teaching at the university level is that you're not teaching to a standardized test anymore. The syllabus is yours. And so I think what happens is often, from my experience, comics get into a syllabus because of the educator. And so what happens is you have an educator who maybe not even in the course that they're ultimately teaching. They're in a class with a comic that is used, and they find it to be engaging, they find it to be interesting. I think at the college level for me, the one that was particularly enlightening was taking a course on learning technologies. And so we learned about this interactive online comics created by the New York Hall of Sciences called Transmissions. And what was so amazing about it is that it wasn't simply science content, but it was teaching the scientific method through narrative. It was talking about testing and hypothesis creating in a way that felt very investigative. And actually at the core of what science is. Science isn't just facts. Science is a thought process. And it came out as a webcomic. And because it was through the New York Hall of Science, it wasn't published ever. And it kind of had its moments. It happened. A handful of people noticed it. They sent it out. It showed up in this class, and I saw it. And that kind of created a rabbit hole. And so it really comes down to inspiring those other educators. And whereas, and kind of giving them that freedom to test something out, there might be a mistake that happens. This was the first year that I taught with comics, it took a while for me to get comics into my syllabus formally. I used to sneak in pretty regularly existential comics to kind of help test them. Okay, so you think you know Nietzsche. Here's a comic where Nietzsche, as a Cleveland Browns fan, is saying why the Ubermensch is a Green Bay Packers fan, and do you get the joke? And so you start there, and slowly you bring it in. I think that the challenges this year were a little different than the challenges that might have happened in other years for perhaps the obvious reasons. And I think to some degree, a lot of it is you have to teach with patience. Depending on your class, you don't know where they're coming from. And I think a really common mistake that certain earlier on educators make is they assume that their learning experience is the same as their students' learning experiences. And that's just not true. And so a lot of it is just teaching with patience, teaching with a lot of knowledge of self and a lot of empathy. And everything else is just details.
Yeah, and it's true for, you have to be patient with the other educators too, because it might be a medium that they're not familiar with. I have a teacher, it's one of my good friends, but she has a hard time reading a comic because she just doesn't know how to read it. So being able to pick the right book that she's passionate about was very important. And then also walking her through on how to read it properly and look at the different panels and things like that. So yeah, patience is very important. I totally agree with you.
How about you, John or Fareed?
What I was going to say is it does require patience. When I teach Watchmen to my AP seniors, some of them get it right away. Others really have a hard time with it. Well, what do I do with these pictures? What do I do? So I teach them about how the words interact with art, and they interact differently depending on the panel and the sequence that they're reading and so on. So it takes a while. And some get really frustrated because these people have never had problems with anything. But then they have problems with comics. And so it does take some time. Most of them don't have problems, but there are some who are just, I just don't understand this. What is this? And so you sit with them and kind of walk them through some of the stuff, and then they finally pick it up. So that's it. It's really just how complex it is. You have to really walk them through the complexity of a comic.
I also found that when I presented my ideas to an administrator about 20 years ago when I was teaching, so long ago, there was a lot of resistance because they couldn't look past the, I guess, what they personally viewed comics as, and couldn't see it as literature and a higher level of art. So you kind of have to work through that too. And a lot of it is figuring out, this is my marketing person and coming through, it's figuring out what they value and presenting them with the right book as well, so that they'll actually give it a chance and put it into the curriculum too, because it's something that they find themselves as important.
So I think country has quite a lot to do with it, right? So if we were to, for example, think about France or Belgium, and you think about bande dessinée or the use of comic books in education and anything, I mean, you have a very, very civilized conversation with people in their late 50s about comic books, and you can have the same conversation with somebody who's 14, and there is no ageism in the reading or usage of graphic novels across the entire age spectrum in Europe. And I love that, but just a small channel away, this little island called the United Kingdom has very much got the same problems with comic books and graphic novels, because they don't get it. They don't get the fact that this is a great medium for people of all ages. And it very much becomes sort of I loved what Joel said earlier, your little comic thing over there, because that's exactly what this becomes. It's sort of a joke. It's not really very serious. So I love it when people like Marjan Satrapi came over and, you know, she was doing her big talk about Persepolis. But I sometimes often think, how much of that was because of the graphic novel, or really did it become much more popular because it became an animated feature, right? So I think that this sort of jump between what remains a graphic novel and what becomes an animated feature is a very important distinction in terms of how wide it goes culturally. And also you can see that these days with so many Netflix shows that are being inspired by graphic novels. So I'm actually really excited about that, because I think inadvertently that will cause an entire generation of creators to chase that dream and say, great, maybe someone here can write the next series on the Harlem Hellfighters, and it becomes a Netflix running, you know, award-winning cartoon series. Fantastic, because as far as I think, I don't want to speak out of turn, but certainly for me, if my children can benefit from learning something through a medium which is as inert as a graphic novel or a comic, I'm so happy, because it's sometimes the best medium to almost transmit the most difficult of messages. So I find that it's a great, I think it's a great medium to actually deliver painful messages that could be softer, easier to understand.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think Joel really hit the head on the nail with is like even beyond perception of what comics are. One of the challenges with comics is also students overcoming the perception of themselves as students. Because what happens is students and their ideas of what they are as a student. Oh, I'm a straight A student. Oh, I am a student who kind of does well, and if I really tried, I'd do better, but I don't really. We all have these images of what we're like as a student when we're that age. And as a result, we cultivate a toolbox of how we are able to enact that identity as a student. We learn, oh, I read this text and I'm going to look for the metaphor and I'm going to raise my hand and I'm going to share the metaphor. And the teacher is going to be happy because I shared that metaphor. And comics function differently, as we've said already. And so like one of the things that I've written about in the book that I wrote with Meryl Jaffe, is that comics can be demotivating for students who really do well on the essays. And you have to accept that, and you have to work with that. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Every student should have to feel like they're struggling with a text at some point in their life. It shouldn't be too difficult, it shouldn't be impossible, but you should learn to struggle. It's good. But as an educator, you have to also take into account the fact that this is different, and students who do well with the same old are going to only want the same old.
I would say the same thing for educators as well. That's a perfect segue, because we're starting to run out of time. I would love to hear from each of you some titles that you recommend, and then something you're either working on or are excited about for educators for the coming year. We can start with that kind of goes the same order. Oh, actually, Joel, go for it.
There's that time delay, some books that I think are really important. Cartooning by Ivan Bernetti is a really good book. I think it's one of those ones that people don't typically look at because it doesn't have a lot of pictures in it, but it's brilliant. The newest book that just won an Eisner by Linda Berry is really fantastic, Making Comics, which is a really great book. Then you've got Scott McCloud and Understanding Comics and Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, but there's a lot of other little books out there. There's one that just came out, which I think is really interesting, about just race in comics, the content of our caricature, by Rebecca Wan. So I just started reading it. It's just amazing about how the cultural anthropology of like how images have permeated throughout and how that shows up in comics. There's been a lot of stuff about representation of minority peoples in movies and films and everything else, but this one sort of goes into it about comics, which I think is really good, because I think comics have and what most people don't understand, and this is one of the theses of the book, is that she actually says that comics has probably a greater role in shaping our perception of how we see people in the world. So I think that's another good one. I am currently finishing up the third book in my Tales of the Talented 10th series, about Robert Smalls, who was a enslaved African who stole the USS Planter. I'm actually like in the final stretch. I'm almost done with it, while I'm also reading every day, stamped from the beginning, Definitive History of Racist Ideas, and drawing the comic version of that, which is daunting, but also really exciting, because it's I don't know if you haven't read it, you should read it. Don't wait 2 years for mine to come out. You can read it now and then read it again when mine comes out. Get it then. But it's a compelling history of the United States as told through the idea of these racist ideas that have permeated throughout American history. So that's my spiel.
Lisa?
Oh, you're on
Lisa,
mute.
you're still on mute.
Definitely The Watchmen. That's such an important book to me. I think that actually helped me understand what graphic novels can really do. And I think that particular book is the book that I recommend to everybody that I know who's not familiar with comics and think it's the old Batman series with like the bang pow, kind of thing. So The Watchmen, Mouse for sure. It's another classic. I like a lot of the history graphic novels, and I really enjoy Sweet Tooth as well, because it really has a stripped down dialogue, and it really relies on the artwork that's very emotive and things like that. Right now for Magnetic Press, I'm actually working on promoting Mr. Invincible, although it doesn't need much promoting. It's already on its second print, and it's been, I think, 2 weeks since it released. It actually won I think the Begonia Children's Book Award, and we had great reviews from SLJ and Booklist and Publishers Weekly, so we're very proud of that. And that particular book is amazing because it actually breaks, I think Joel will be interested in this book, it actually breaks comic book physics, and it causes even adults like me have to look at the panels and kind of figure out how everything kind of happens sequentially, because it kind of moves between time. It's really interesting. I'll send you guys a PDF after this, so you guys can check it out. And then also another book that we're getting ready to promote is Pastuvi. And I love how my publisher describes it. He describes it as mischievous Winnie the Pooh for troublemakers. So I feel like a lot of middle school students are going to really enjoy that, because I considered myself a troublemaker, and I would love to see Winnie the Pooh be really bad, but the bad little fox. And then for our AWA, we're working on our trades. Our trade promotions coming out in October. One of them is really a big deal. It was actually launched during the pandemic, about a pandemic. So it's called The Resistance, and it actually touched on a lot of different things that actually happened to us during the whole COVID-19, with people being xenophobic, hurting each other, the politics of the lies that you see on TV about certain things, or the truths that actually do come out, all these different things, riots. It's amazing. It's actually told by Straczynski, JMS, who did Babylon 5 and some other books, since 8. So he actually foresaw all this stuff, and that happened in COVID-19 2 years ago when he was writing this comic, and it's actually kind of scary to read because it really mirrors what's going on right now. Protests, statues coming down, all of that.
Awesome.
It's really fascinating.
John, what are you excited about?
To recommend some books, I really love nonfiction comics. That's my go-to generally. So one of the things, I actually have things to hold up, and it's backwards, of course, but Logic Comics is really cool. It's about the early life of Bertrand Russell, how he became a mathematician, but it's also about these comic book writers trying to write about and make sense of his early life. So it's really pretty complex in terms of the narrative. It's not just about Bertrand Russell, it's about what does it mean to write about Bertrand Russell, which is very cool. Another nonfiction one that I loved, and it won the Lynn Ward Prize in like 2016, Rolling Blackouts. And it's a comic book writer, graphic novelist, went to, with some other journalists to the Arab world after the invasions and stuff, after the invasions, and interviewed people, and it becomes as much about a lot of these interviews and how these Arab people felt in the light of the invasions. But it's also about journalism itself. So in a journalism class, that would be a great thing to look at. One last one. It's my favorite thing is Monsters. That's actually a fiction book, and it looks like a YA book, but it's about art history. It's set in the late 60s, early 70s. It's about art history. It's about the Holocaust. And it's about this 13-year-old girl coming to terms with the fact that she's gay. And she actually presents herself as a monster. You don't know she's gay until later in the book, and that's why she's a monster. She's coming to terms with her sexuality as well. It's really, really cool book.
Fareed?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. So I also really enjoy nonfiction quite a bit, and I think in particular, I think for the teaching of history, but also again at that intersection of STEM, I am such a huge fan of this book called Heroes of the Mind. It's Marx, Freud, and Einstein. The story of all three, I think in my eyes, absolute heroes, and just to wrap your head around all of the stuff that they believed in or created for this world today is difficult enough. But the author, she just does such Corinne Mayer just does such a fantastic job of explaining it to the reader that I would highly recommend that to any teacher anywhere. I think they'd really enjoy it. And I think that students go off and they always, because there's three different, between Marx, Freud, and Einstein, what have you not covered? I mean, it's incredible. So that's one huge suggestion. The other one is this book that is called The Hacktivist it was actually backed by Alyssa Milano. I'm sure a lot of you will remember her from the TV shows back in the day, but she's quite an activist. The book is called Hacktivist, and it's a lot about this whole thing around misinformation, disinformation, which brings me to one of the projects I'm really excited about, and I'm actually currently working with Michael on, which for one of the U.S. Government agencies, we are actually doing a graphic novel on the impact of disinformation on various different stories. And that's going to be coming out later in October. So really, really excited to be working on that. It is very much targeting, college-going audiences. So I'm excited to see how different educators will take to that. And finally, if I may, this is something I wrote. It's called Two Brothers in a Shoe. And you can probably see there's the Adidas logo and the little Puma one. So two brothers, Adi and Rudy Daschler. So this is the entire story of how these two kids, and their father was a cobbler, and how $2 billion companies came out of one little home. And the series is real economics, but I think what we're trying to teach there is the whole concept of how something that is so commodity, a shoe, can be differentiated through a brand. And I think, again, this is something that college-going audiences can find quite interesting. So I'm really excited. Thank you so much for sharing all of your suggestions. I'm definitely going to be ordering quite a lot of books tonight, probably. Thank you so much.
Yeah, panels are expensive.
They are, good Lord.
Talia, would you like to wrap us up?
Sure. So I don't know if I actually mentioned the comic that I use in my philosophy course. It's Day Tripper by Fabio and Gabriel Ba. It's an amazing text to put into conversation with Plato. I've used it in conversation with the Tao Te Ching, Nietzsche. Like, there's a lot there that can engage with existentialism, and it puts it. It came out of after postmodernism, which means that you could like take Socrates down a notch because he was a jerk, a smart jerk, but a jerk. Beyond that STEM, this is absolutely for middle grade, but I think it's genius. It's the Big Ideas series by Don Brown. What he does is it's not about a person, it's not about an accomplishment, it's about a process. So going from ancient history to the 60s, the history of getting someone to the moon. And these were all of the steps that it took. And so you think about it as a cultural accomplishment. One book, and then two books that I'd love to teach someday at college. One is called Photographic. It is, I'm blanking on the creator, but it's the biography of Graciela Iturbide, who was a Mexican photographer, and it's all about the history of Mexican photography art. And it is really good at demystifying this idea of Mexican culture, because there's no such thing as American, like, culture is multifaceted. There's so much to it. And if you spend any time, you learn as much. And I think that this graphic novel is very good at doing that. And then finally, one that, like, I think a lot of people would laugh at me, and this would be the one, like, if I ever get tenure, like, if, and I'm not worried about anything, this is the one. It's the Comic Book History of Beer by Jonathan Hennessy. And the reason why I think it's great, and like he did all of these other fantastic history graphic novels. And I think that what is so charming about this is that it kind of takes history and anthropology hand in hand. So it's about how beer changed society and how society changed beer. And it takes something that we really kind of don't look at. We tend to take for granted, especially in college. And it makes you focus a little bit more in on it. And I think that it's a really good way to kind of get kids thinking a little bit more at that age.
Well, I'm only going to recommend one because we are running out of time, literally, or actually probably past our time. And actually, it's Joel's book, Fights. As educators are starting to finally come to be aware and wrestle with anti-racism in our system, I have not found a book yet, prose or comics, that brings in so many different layers at so many different age levels. If you want something that is a powerful tool to have conversations with parents, Fights is amazing. So thank you, Joel, for creating one of the best books of the year for me as an educator. I want to thank the entire panel. We could have kept going. I would have loved to have kept going because I still had more questions. But thank you all. Appreciate it very, very much, and all the best. This panel is promoted by LitX. Those educators and students and comic book enthusiasts, please check us out on Twitter @LitX. We have an amazing cohort of educators from all different age levels, and we just love talking about comics and education. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you in another panel.
Thanks, Jill.
Thank
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this first panel in conjunction with New York Comic Con's Metaverse. Please be sure to click that subscribe button on the bottom of this video, and please be sure to follow LitX on Twitter @WeAreLitX. Until next time, take care.